Forza Motorsport and Gran Turismo. For years, these behemoths have stood as pillars representing the very best in realistic driving games across their respective platforms. As Gran Turismo nears its 20th anniversary and Forza its 12th, both series return, with brand new installments focusing on the best the developers have to offer. And like the battle between driver and track, these two series have long stood as rivals. Today we're going to explore the craftsmanship poured into each game to better appreciate what each series brings to the table. This inevitably means drawing direct comparisons between them while highlighting the strengths and weaknesses of each game. How do they stack up under the microscope? Let's find out. At the center of both games is a focus on 60 frames per second racing, and each developer arrives at this objective with its own unique approach. Getting to this level of performance is no small feat, but we feel that the developers have both been very successful in reaching it. In creating the following comparisons then, we captured Gran Turismo Sport from a PS4 Pro using the game's higher resolution 1800p mode, while in the case of Forza 7, we settled on the PC version with all settings maxed out and resolution set to native 4K. Aside from minor improvements on the PC such as 60Hz reflections and mirrors, this should offer an experience comparable to the Xbox One X version of the game. Forza 7 offers a huge range of tracks and track configurations to race on. Many of these tracks offer variable weather, enabling some beautiful but challenging track conditions. The environments are richly detailed with super high resolution textures created using photogrammetry. It also features a huge selection of richly detailed cars, exceeding what's available in the competition. Gran Turismo Sport, on the other hand, focuses on a limited selection of tracks and cars, but presents them in a near photorealistic manner. With incredibly realistic lighting and richly crafted vehicles, there is a lot more detail present in the game than you might first believe. And the central pillar of any racing game lies in its cars, and the detail present in each and every model. Let's begin our comparison with the Mazda MX-5. As a convertible, we're able to clearly examine the interior and exterior alike. Using the photo mode in both games, we can zoom in and take a closer look at each detail. Importantly, from what we can tell, car and track detail in photo mode is identical to what you see during gameplay in both Forza and Gran Turismo. Let's begin with the exterior then, starting with the headlight assembly. The plastic housing is well defined in both instances, and the reflector lens simulates the appearance of light penetration. Moving to the rear, we immediately see a subtle difference in the way the plastic housing is rendered, likely down to the variance in the physically based rendering model used on Gran Turismo. There is more visible occlusion in the crevices on the GT side as well. The Mazda badge adorning the front of the vehicle is also suitably detailed in both instances. Then we have the wheels themselves. In this case, I feel that Gran Turismo has an advantage in terms of realistic material with visible sparkle and smoother modeling overall. And how about this windshield fluid nozzle? Once again, we see a subtle difference in detail between the two games. And the same goes for this rear brake light. Notice the more rounded edges where the body panels end on Gran Turismo. Or how about the door handle? The lighting conditions and material are slightly different here, but the paint color is supposed to be the same. What's interesting is that there's a keyhole on GT, while Forza's version of the MX-5 uses the more expensive key fob remote button option. This also helps highlight a difference in the way paint is handled across cars. It seems that GT's paint features a lower Fresnel, a high glossiness, and a lower highlight glossiness next to Fresnel and reflection, which better simulates the paint and clear coat effect. Forza, on the other hand, appears to link Fresnel, reflection glossiness, and specular highlights at a high level, which results in less nuanced paint surfaces that reflect light differently. Then we move into the cockpit, and this is where Gran Turismo really shines. First, the seat material. Forza's MX-5 features leather seats while GT offers the cloth option. The different types of material visible in the GT side do suggest more realistic materials and texture work overall though. I suppose it has a Bose sound system as well. And how about the center stack? Both games do an excellent job here with modeled dials, a detailed shifter, and realistic buttons. GT does have the edge in terms of raw polygon count however, with more rounded dials here in the center. Once again though, the Forza car has the premium options like heated seats and the GPS display, which also translates to the rear-mounted antenna, which is missing on the more basic head unit modeled in GT. And if you haven't noticed by now, the GT version of the MX-5 was modeled after the Japanese domestic right-hand drive version, while the Forza version of the car is clearly the American model. Makes sense, right? How about these air vents then? Both are very detailed. But Forza is lacking proper occlusion shadowing, making it look more like a CAD render in some ways. Looking at the two MX-5s, it's clear that GT has the edge overall in terms of detail, but considering the extra development time and lower overall car count, it starts to make sense. So how about the turbocharged Porsche GT2 RS featured in Forza 7 versus the less powerful GT3 RS in Gran Turismo Sport? Both are beautifully crafted machines with smooth lines and excellent bodywork, and both feature accurate taillights corresponding to the individual model. The interior again is similar and well modeled, but slightly more difficult to see through the reflection covered glass, hence why we started with the Mazda. So both games offer excellent car models then, with slight variation in quality. GT does have the edge in terms of materials and shading and overall detail, but with Turn 10 producing so many more vehicles overall, the difference does start to make sense. But what about the tracks and environments? Forza features a blend of all-business racetracks with green fields and tire walls, contrasted against more impressive environments like Prague and Switzerland. The game features a large number of tracks overall, and on PC and Xbox One X, boasts ultra-high resolution textures, taking advantage of the extra available memory. Gran Turismo in comparison features a smaller selection of tracks, but nearly all of them are gorgeous to behold thanks to fine details and exquisite lighting. When placed side by side, it's clear that both games offer a high level of detail across their environments, but there are noticeable differences between how these details have been implemented. Forza presents a slightly more stable overall image due to some decisions which we'll be examining shortly, but GT is a little more ambitious with some of its choices which can more easily highlight some of its flaws. Forza may appear faster in motion due to a slightly different focal length and the subtle use of motion blur, but rest assured that the two games do line up almost perfectly, especially when racing on a laser scan track like the Nürburgring. The speed between the games is the same, as it should be since they are both attempting to mimic real-life driving. As an aside, I had to settle for an older BMW E92 M3 GT2 versus the newer F13 M6 GT3 on this track, but I was able to match the speed for the most part, so it does line up really nicely. The most noticeable differences on a track like this lie in the way the trees are rendered, the textures on the ground, and the way distant scenery is handled. Polyphony Digital tends to draw more detail further into the distance, with visible hills and other things happening in the background that might not be present on the Forza side. It's kind of like this on other tracks as well, like the Suzuka track, where we can see more details in the distance as well. Still, while driving through the tracks, both games do offer supremely detailed environments, but what really separates them? To find out, let's break down the individual pieces of what makes a track. For starters, there's the textures. Both games offer a good variety of highly detailed texture work, but up close, Forza 7 clearly has an advantage in terms of texture resolution on the track. While racing, it's difficult to notice, but it stands out when looking closely. Looking at a track like Brands Hatch, the initial reaction is that they do look very similar indeed, with slight variations in object placement around the track. Details are often presented in different places as well. GT Sport focuses on the pit crew in this scene, while Forza features a selection of maintenance carts instead. You should be starting to see that the detail level between the two is highly comparable, just a little different. If we flip the camera around, you can take a look at the pit from a different angle. Again, they're very comparable in terms of overall scene geometry, but each game has its own set of flourishes. But what if we go deeper? Well, how about the crowds? These two systems are very different. Up close, Forza relies more on flat 2D textures scattered throughout the stands with an occasional flag-waving polygonal man. In comparison, GT features a combination of simple 3D polygonal characters mixed with a few 2D elements, so it's kind of the reverse of Forza. The bitmapped characters in Forza jostle around ever so slightly to give the impression of motion, while GT's 3D crowd system features more animation and even actual shadows cast by the 3D models. Both kind of fall apart when you look too closely, but in motion, it works pretty well. Then there's the trees. This has become a point of contention between the two games, as they handle trees very differently. In Forza, trees generally consist of two flat planes, or billboards, in a cross pattern fixed to the ground. While driving, this means that the trees are stationary and do not rotate with the camera frustum. These billboards lack any sort of realistic light interaction and do not self-shadow properly, but as a result can appear less distracting during a race due to the lack of artifacts. GT is a little more ambitious here. It uses flat planes, which are always facing the player, but pairs this up with more complex tree trunks and branches, and in many cases multiple billboards together. These trees also accept light and shadow, meaning that they sit more realistically within the environment. The issue here is that during some races the shadow positioning can create strange edges at a distance, on top of the minor pop-up that we've observed. The trees in GT are clearly more detailed overall, especially up close, but the selected method can sometimes produce less pleasing results during a race. It's an interesting situation to be sure. If we pause here again, you can see that the trees are much more detailed on Gran Turismo, but it's easier to see the limitations compared to the simplified Forza trees as well. Let us know in the comments which implementation you prefer. Then we come to lighting. Both games appear to use pre-computed global illumination data to light the world, but the data used in Gran Turismo Sport enables more natural and realistic looking scenes than any other racing game I've played. Low contrast lighting is especially difficult to get right, but GT absolutely nails it. It almost seems as if we're looking at a solution not unlike Assassin's Creed Unity, which is another benchmark title for pre-calculated global illumination. This would explain why GT Sport offers multiple selectable times of day from the menu, but not real-time dynamic changes. Each selection uses different static GI data, again similar to AC Unity or something like infamous Second Son. That's not to say Forza 7 doesn't bring the goods. It has a very different, but generally still beautiful appearance to its lighting. Some tracks, such as Prague, look absolutely stunning and highly realistic, while the mountains of Switzerland feature very subtle lighting that feels spot on. Both look great in terms of lighting, but we feel that GT Sport takes pole position here with its more realistic implementation across all tracks. Now, one element that becomes apparent once you start comparing the two is the difference in how shadows are implemented. With Forza 7, Turn 10 continues to utilize baked shadows across its environment. All static objects rely on fixed shadow data, while dynamic objects such as cars and select pieces of scenery use real-time shadows instead. In comparison, all world shadows are generated and rendered in real time in Gran Turismo Sport. Both implementations are equally valid, and offer different strengths and weaknesses. The benefit to using baked shadows is clear. They are cheaper to render, and the render quality itself can be much higher and devoid of artifacts. Static, baked shadows can give the impression of casting on dynamic objects, however, due to the way dynamic shadows are implemented across each object. They can cast a shadow and draw approximations of received shadows on themselves. In comparison, the shadows in GT Sport often show noticeable artifacts along the shadow cascade. Distant shadows lose definition, and long shadows can suffer from visible breakup. On the flip side, with Forza, storing all this baked shadow data across multiple tracks likely requires a ton of storage space, possibly increasing the size of the game. It's not surprising that Forza weighs in at over 90 gigabytes. GT Sport, however, features many more unique, selectable times of day, all of which have unique shadow positioning. This certainly would have required more storage space. Each time of day sees shadows adjust to the sun position, while Forza shadows are limited by the baking process and mostly static. So basically, Forza's solution requires more storage space, limits the potential of the sun, and doesn't apply equally to all objects. GT, on the other hand, exhibits more artifacts and breakup, but shadows can be modified based on the position of the sun without the need to store baked shadow data. Time of day changes are an interesting point of discussion then. Forza 7 offers a limited time of day cycling option, while GT Sport restricts you to just times of day selectable from a menu. In examining the Forza technique, I discovered that it does not update the time of day in real time, however. If you sit still and capture a time lapse, nothing changes. Instead, time of day appears to be tied to race progression, which isn't a bad way to do things in this case. The clouds and cloud shadows both move here, but the sun position never changes and lighting remains static. But this is where a limitation of baked shadows appears. World shadows cannot be adjusted to the sun position. Instead, it appears to be limited to a small pocket of time, such as evening to nightfall, rather than an entire day, which is still a step beyond Gran Turismo Sport. Perhaps this subtle time of day is the cause for less visible or missing shadows compared to Forza 6 even. Notice how these tree shadows are no longer included in the baked shadow layer here? Ultimately, Forza does at least attempt to simulate very slight time of day changes, which is great, while GT's time of day is tied to a menu setting and never changes during a race. Interestingly, if you look back, Gran Turismo 6 does feature real-time time of day changes. I suspect the baked GI and GT Sport is part of the reason why it's not featured here. Then we come to flourishes unique to each game. In Forza, there are more dynamic objects scattered about each track designed to enhance your racing experience. Yes, there are tire walls here with individual tires that do react to your car. Crashes in general have much more visible impact in Forza. All of this is absent or reduced in Gran Turismo Sport. On the flip side, GT Sport has these gorgeous lit particles that appear when racing at night. As you drive through the dirt, brake and tail lights appear in the dirt particles, something absent in Forza 7. Both games, however, cast real-time shadows from headlights while racing at night, which is a neat feature, and you can even see individual light sources from each car far off into the distance, which just looks amazing. Forza 7 also includes screen space sun shafts on certain tracks, adding an extra element to the lighting as you drive headfirst into the sunlight. On GT Sport, there's simply a sun glare instead. Then there are the reflections. The two games employ different techniques for this feature. In Forza, the game basically uses image data from a previous frame in generating reflections for the cars, which is why you can see things like the driving line reflected in the bodywork. On Xbox One and Xbox One X, these reflections appear to be updated at half the frame rate or 30 frames per second. You can see it update here every other frame in this footage. With GT Sport, things are a little more complicated. The game uses a static cube map for the world, which is more demanding, but as a result, this means that the resolution of the reflections had to be reduced. What's odd here is that there seems to be variation in the update rate. In many instances, reflections do appear to update at a full 60 frames per second. You can see it here update with every frame. In other cases, it updates at just 20 frames per second instead, and this occurs primarily when using the cockpit view. And here's where it gets really weird. All reflections on all cars are based on what's reflected on the player's car. They all share the same cube map. So when you pass under a bridge, you see that same bridge reflected at the same time on another car. In the end, both solutions work well enough, but there are compromises to each one. While we're discussing image quality then, we should talk about the resolution difference as well. Most of the footage in the video has been captured from a PC, though we're looking at Xbox One X now. But everything you're seeing has been rendered at a native 4K, resulting in excellent super sharp image quality. In comparison, GT Sport operates at 1800p using checkerboard rendering. Image quality is still good, mind you, but it's clear that Forza 7 has a huge advantage in terms of raw image quality. One aspect of Gran Turismo that we cannot fail to mention, however, are the replays. GT Sport might just feature the single best replay angles and effects we've seen in any racing game to date. Yes, it sounds hyperbolic, but the camera work, motion blur quality, and depth of field combine to create highly impressive results. Replays in GT Sport are top notch. Now, this has always been the case with the series, but the PS3 installments fell somewhat short with frame rate issues and lower quality post-processing. Forza 7 isn't bad in this regard, mind you, but the angle choices and lower quality motion blur aren't quite on par. It's true that in the grand scheme of things, replays are not the most important element here in a racing game, but it is nice to share and save them when you have a great race, and they do look best in GT Sport. I think even hardcore Forza fans can agree that Polyphony Digital knows what it's doing when it comes to replays. As a side note, looking at all those cars, it should be mentioned that Forza 7 supports a full 24 car grid in all its various modes, while GT Sport only offers 24 cars in a race in specific modes such as online racing. In arcade mode, it's capped at just 20 cars. Okay, but there are two other unique features offered in Gran Turismo that I want to mention real quick. First is the split screen mode. Here, two players can race side by side, each with their own widescreen view of the action. The windows are small, true, it's limited to just 2 cars and the crowds are missing, but it's split screen and it's 60 frames per second, which is impressive indeed and very uncommon these days. I did run into a weird bug with it though. For most of this video I captured with the HUD disabled for maximum effect, but if you start the split screen mode like this, the word finish appears on the second player's side and it remains there throughout the entire race. The only fix is to re-enable the HUD in single player, then go back to split screen mode and play again. Then there's the PSVR option, which allows you to play arcade races using a VR headset. I don't have any good 60 FPS capture of the game in action in VR unfortunately, but I can say that trying it out myself, it looks pretty darn impressive despite the low resolution. Now I could go on and on about the various features in both of these games, but I think we've covered a lot already, so let's reflect back on what we've looked at today. First, Forza 7. What really impresses here is the fact that the game is so beautiful even on a standard Xbox One console. That Turn 10 can pull off such a solid, stable game on the original Xbox One at 1080p 60 is a testament to its design teams. Very impressive work. And then with the Xbox One X, we have a gorgeous 60 frames per second 4K native title right at launch. It's all great stuff. GT Sport then is a massive improvement over the PlayStation 3 installments of the game and looks marvelous as well, but it obviously has lost some of the content with its new focus. Still, with its presentation, it proves once again that Polyphony Digital has some of the most talented technical artists on the planet. The results are remarkable. Ultimately, whether you're into Gran Turismo or Forza, both games are gorgeous and represent top teams' work at peak levels to deliver high frame rate, beautiful racing games for both consoles. Each title has its own advantages over the other in terms of visual quality, but it's fair to say that neither one is short of gorgeous. From the looks of it, both games will continue to evolve as well. For instance, certain challenges in GT Sport suggest that rain will appear at a later date, kinda like it did with Drive Club, but we'll have to wait and see. What is the takeaway from a video like this then? Well, I hope that we have provided a deeper insight into what these developers go through to reach the all-important 60 frames per second. The price of 60 frames per second appears in many forms, and while we cannot see everything under the hood, we can at least try to appreciate the work that goes into making it happen. And this goes for all racing games targeting 60 FPS really, and that includes the gorgeous Project Cars 2, which unfortunately was beyond the scope of this video. With that, however, we've come to the end of this showdown. Which of the two do you guys think looks better overall? Be sure to let us know below, and as GT Man would say, don't make yourself look bad in the comments, because looking bad is not good. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.